Here we have an international legal system that has been hijacked. The consequences for that are not just problematic for Israel, but for any country that actually prizes rule of law. I have a commitment to the truth.
These international organizations like the UN, all created in the wake of the Holocaust and now seem to be working against Jews. It's quite astonishing.
It is part of the fabric of the United Nations. There is an inbuilt majority against Israel at the United Nations, which is why these political resolutions against Israel are passed with such ease.
I want to ask about America.
The Americans in particular said at some point enough is enough. A ceasefire of some form was instituted, which simply enabled Hamas to continue building up its terror infrastructure.
So what do you think the real motivation was then?
Follow the money. Peace is not going to come from a piece of paper or a handshake on the lawn of the White House and an American president saying, oh, see, I fixed it. Peace comes from building people-to-people cooperation.
Do you have any ideas about what we can expect next?
There's a much bigger battle here to be fought.
Natasha Hausdorff, thank you so much for coming to speak with me. This is now the 1-year anniversary of October 7th. And over the last week or so, over the last month, certainly the last few days, dramatic changes in Israel. Of course, 200 ballistic missiles sent by Iran. We had the terror attack. This is October 1st in Jaffa, where at least 7 Israelis were killed, perhaps more. Last month, we had the pager attack. We had the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah. We had the elimination in July of Ismail Haniyeh. Sinwar is now head of Hamas. There's been dramatic changes in Israel, and great to speak with you. You're unbelievably qualified. I mean, you've shot to fame with the fantastic dragon slaying of Mehdi Hassan at the Monk debates in Canada, which I'm keen to ask you about. I saw you last week at the Beacon Theatre in New York speaking alongside Douglas Murray, but as well as law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv universities, you were a fellow in the National Security Law Program at Columbia Law School in New York. You previously worked at the American law firm Skadden Arps in London and Brussels and clerked for the President of Israeli Supreme Court Chief Justice Miriam Naor. And I also understand you worked with Douglas Murray at the Center for Social Cohesion. You're probably the most qualified person I've ever interviewed. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
It really is my pleasure. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to really drilling down into a lot of these issues that, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be scope to get into properly in other contexts. So yeah. It's great.
Well, seeing as it's the 1st-year anniversary of October 7th, I wonder if you might recall where you were on October 7th and how that news affected you personally.
Well, I woke up pretty early to reports of incredible airstrikes, and I knew immediately that Israel was at war, and followed, I remember that morning in particular, followed the developments. So much of what we were seeing on social media was coming live from Hamas footage, everything that they were recording on GoPros and transmitting around the world. There were no attempts by them to hide the atrocities that they were engaging in. And in this age, especially of social media and of WhatsApp, so much of the news breaking was occurring in those silos rather than on national or international broadcast media. So that was my initial experience. And I have to say that the interviews I started giving, trying to explain the context, give some information absolutely about the background to these atrocities by Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations, but also explain the legal implications of Israel's inevitable response. And I remember the first interview I gave on Sky News, I did provide a warning. I said, remember this time, because it won't be long until Israel is under fire, especially in the context of media coverage of this, and the finger will be very squarely turned on Israel. And I anticipated that the memory of the 7th of October and the discussions that were very much part of that first day, and the subsequent one on the 8th would disappear very quickly. And I'm sorry to say that I think I was right. I gave it a couple of weeks at the time, and I think it was more fairly only a matter of days before the narrative changed and before Israel was starting to be blamed for the very crimes that were committed against Israelis on the 7th and subsequently.
You were right, it was a matter of days. I remember being in London, and October 9th I went to the vigil on Whitehall, which was a wonderful experience with lots of Israel flags and Hebrew hymns. But taking the tube home that night, I was face to face with people returning from the Israel embassy in Kensington across London. They were wearing keffiyehs, and I saw on my phone they had been celebrating, setting off flares on their knees, praising Allah. And so it was very much days, certainly on the ground, before we saw celebrations here in London about the atrocity that happened.
Well, even on the 7th of October itself, not far from where we're sitting here in Westminster on Edgware Road, they were handing out baklawa and singing and chanting, and I think there may even have been some small fireworks set off. So I do know people who happened to be in the vicinity at the time and saw that unfolding. And when you think that was what was happening on the streets of London, since then, of course, we've seen calls for intifada, calls for a genocide against the Jews, and many joining those calls without a proper understanding of what it is that they were lending their voices to. You know, calls for intifada are not just against Israel, but everything that we here in London experienced with the 7/7 bombings, in Manchester with the Manchester Arena attacks, on the London Bridge attacks. All of that is very much the same terror that Israel has been facing, not just, of course, over the last 12 months, but for many decades now. And that disconnect between the reality and the narrative is extremely troubling and only seems to be gathering further steam.
Well, let's come back to Britain and what's going on here. But let's maybe first look at the latest developments in Israel and what they mean. As I said earlier, Iran have sent 200 ballistic missiles, and we're awaiting, I guess, an Israeli response to that. I also mentioned the Jaffa terror attack, but tremendous gains in Lebanon now. But
targeted small missions that we understand the IDF has said, well, that there were a substantial number of casualties as a result of one of them. 8 soldiers lost yesterday morning. We're recording this, of course, on the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, in anticipation of the memorial of the 7th of October next week. But those, I mean, it's been talked about in the context of an invasion by Israel of Lebanon. I think it's very important to understand that actually over a number of months now, there have been targeted raids into southern Lebanon, specifically to deal with the tunnel infrastructure that Hezbollah has built, and also rocket launch sites, because while Hezbollah has been using the south of Lebanon to fire onto Israeli civilian communities in the north for the last 12 months, Israel has been trying to take out a number of those on those, targeted precision internal missions.
Yeah, what Hezbollah have been doing to northern Israel seems to be largely ignored, certainly by mainstream media, as in very important context for what's going on. But it's been incredibly successful, it seems. The high command of Hezbollah has been completely wiped out. Yeah. The targeted pager attack from mid-September was also unbelievably effective, I'd say, although there were...
We don't know who's responsible for that, but yes, unbelievably effective.
Israel have not taken responsibility for that?
No. Which, I mean... The general consensus is, they would be the ones capable. But of course, Hezbollah has many enemies in the Western world also. The remarkable thing about the pager attack is how targeted it was and the groundwork that went into it. So the explanation that we have had is that Hezbollah switched to pagers, which is quite an old technology. Sure, I never used a pager, because it was concerned about Israel monitoring their smartphone network. So every important Hezbollah operative was issued with one of these pagers. Those are the pagers that exploded, not just killing a number of very high-profile Hezbollah operatives, but also wounding, incapacitating. We understand some 3,000. So you're absolutely right that whoever is responsible for that operation successfully not only took out a great percentage of the Hezbollah leadership, but also entirely disrupted their ability to communicate. The command and control structure was decimated. And as a result, I think we've seen, albeit there has been substantial firing onto Israel by Hezbollah, especially since that incident, their capacity with hundreds of thousands of rockets, including long-range rockets that can cover the entirety of Israel, we haven't seen the kind of response that was concerning, not just to Israel, but also to Israel's key allies. And certainly many commentators, military experts are opining that one of the key reasons for that is that this terror organization is still in disarray because of those exploding pagers, quickly followed by the exploding walkie-talkies, exploding intercoms. So this was a very carefully prepared, thoroughly thought through process. I have seen one report attributing it to Israel that indicated it was a young woman who came up with this idea in the first place, a young woman serving in the intelligence services. And I'm inclined to think that would be a nice explanation because it's certainly out-of-the-box thinking.
Yeah.
To target Hezbollah-issued communications devices of this nature is the most targeted of strikes that one can possibly imagine. And if it's a young woman who
why are you smiling? Is this a victory for feminism or something? Is that how I should understand it?
It's quite a nice. It is quite a nice thought that there may be, certainly young Israelis have stepped up in a way which I think was difficult to imagine before the 7th of October. And Douglas has mentioned this many times in the talks that we have given recently on tour in the US, how impressed he has been with respect to the younger generation in Israel, their competence, their bravery, their commitment, their dedication. And it did make me smile when I saw this report the other day, because for an operation which will ultimately go down in military history, the idea that this is a young woman who might have been at the centre of it, I think is encouraging, and perhaps intelligence services and militaries around the world should take note of including bright new ideas in future operations.
Yes, except that I'm now absolutely terrified of my telephone, and I imagine it changes warfare forever.
Well, given that you are not involved in a terror organisation, I would say that you...
Well, it depends who you ask. We are apparently Zionist shills who are terrorists, if you ask certain people. But, yeah.
Well, I don't know about that. I certainly, as a barrister, have always taken my professional obligations very seriously. And part of the reason that I have been moved to speak out over the last 12 months, especially in relation to the way international law is being misrepresented, is because I have a commitment to the truth, to the proper representation of international law and rule of law. And I'm very encouraged that there are a number of individuals who have likewise sought to speak out and call out the false information, the misrepresentations. And if that means those are some of the terms lobbed in exchange, then I think that's a small price to pay for the very important obligation that I see on both of us.
Yeah, agreed. We'll come back to international law and international situation, but as well as the targeted attack in Lebanon, there is the killing of Hassan Nasrallah in a missile attack apparently launched. I've learned this from a private conversation with Douglas Murray, which he then printed in this information in The Spectator, which is that it was launched by Netanyahu just moments before Netanyahu took to the stage in New York to give his UN speech.
Yes.
So this is also a pretty huge deal, and it seems like Hezbollah has been somewhat taken care of. How much more do we need to be concerned about Hezbollah now?
Well, it's important to remember that their forces, the Radwan forces, are still extremely powerful, albeit the communications networks have been disrupted. They still exist. And their intention, their genocidal intention against Israel is clear. Hassan Nasrallah himself made that clear in multiple speeches. But these recent incursions into Lebanon that we have discussed were the result of an imminent fear that a very similar plan for the 7th of October was about to be executed in the north. So one thing that I've certainly learned from my visits to Israel in the last 12 months, and in particular engagement with experts in the north of the country, is that the plan that was executed on the 7th of October wasn't expected in the south at all. It was actually expected in the north because Hezbollah special forces had been advertising their intention to infiltrate, to attack the communities in the north of Israel in exactly the same way that Hamas ultimately executed along with other Palestinian terrorist organizations and by all accounts, ordinary supposed civilians crossing the border and joining in. That attack was always expected from the north.
Did that influence the IDF? Were they then in the north rather than the south? Does that sort of explain some of why they were not in the Gaza envelope on October 7th? It's
said to explain part of why the initial warnings, especially from young women monitoring the border, saying that the activity that they were seeing along the border immediately before the 7th of October atrocities were carried out, those warnings weren't taken seriously. The expectation was that the major threat would be from Hezbollah in exactly the same way. But there are a whole range of factors that contributed to Israel's complacency, perhaps that's the word to use, on the southern border, not least that for many years, Israel had engaged in very quiet negotiations with Hamas and anticipated as a result that Hamas would be more invested in building up the local civilian population and building up its own financial resources and ultimately improving lives of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
Sorry, go on.
No, arguably there's a naivety that may have attached to that. And ultimately there will be inquiries in Israel as to how this went so badly wrong. But that complacency, in some respects, was born out of those ongoing negotiations. In some respects, it was born out, I believe, of international pressure on Israel to engage in security concessions, to believe that Hamas might be reasoned with. And clearly, not just the Israeli government, but also the vast majority of the Israeli public has been disabused of those notions by the last 12 months.
So the idea that, and I guess you mean Netanyahu specifically was in negotiations with Hamas, but that
it was continued by successive governments. So right. It's not just one individual. It was a matter of Israeli policy.
But that policy has inspired a lot of the anti-Semitic crap that I've seen online, suggesting that Netanyahu deliberately wanted October 7th to happen. Do you think I've right in understanding that? Have you seen that?
I have. I mean, these are conspiracy theories, as you say, born out of anti-Semitism.
So what do you think the real motivation was then, if not that?
The real motivation behind the Israeli government
negotiating with Hamas,
seeking quiet. Because since Hamas's violent takeover of the Gaza Strip in 2007, Israel stuck between a rock and a hard place. It never wanted to have to go back into Gaza. Let's not forget that it withdrew. Every Israeli citizen, every Jew was ethnically cleansed from Gaza in 2005 in pursuit of peace, ultimately. Right? It was a withdrawal to say, let's see what the Americans, what the international community can seek to build. The Israelis left behind greenhouses, left behind an industry, which was destroyed. And instead of building the Singapore of the Middle East, as many had hoped, Hamas turned Gaza into a terror base, an Iranian outpost that threatened Israel continually. It was in 2008 that the first war occurred with Gaza, and the rocket fire began very soon after Hamas's violent takeover. Now, you don't retake the whole of Gaza for a couple of rockets, even though that is precisely what Ariel Sharon promised when the withdrawal took place. Their rockets will be back. Mm-hmm. That didn't happen. And it took subsequent wars where Israel on each occasion sought to degrade Hamas's capability to terrorize Israeli civilians in the south of Israel, in the kibbutzim and moshavim around the Gaza border. But on each of those occasions, it wasn't permitted to win. On each of those occasions, the Americans in particular said at some point, enough is enough. a ceasefire of some form was instituted, which simply enabled Hamas to continue building up its terror infrastructure. And it's not just that. It's everything that has supported that terror infrastructure for the last 20 years. The indoctrination that kindergarten children are subject to until they, from kindergarten up, to believe that the highest calling in life is to become a martyr, to believe that the only way that they can really make their parents proud is by killing as many Jews as possible. And we've seen that on some of the footage coming out of the 7th of October. A young Palestinian calling his parents from the phone of a Jewish woman he had murdered, telling his parents how proud they should be of him, of how many Jews he had killed with his own hands, and you hear the parents' reactions on the phone. That is as a result of decades of indoctrination that has been facilitated by the international community. And let's be perfectly clear about this. The UK government has reinstituted its funding of UNRWA. UNRWA is at the cause of everything we have seen, not just for the last 12 months, everything we have seen for decades. It was established in order to perpetuate the conflict amongst Palestinians, and one of the key means that it does this is through the education system. 3/4 of the terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October were educated in UN-run schools under the UNRWA system.
Can you just explain one thing there, because this is your history I don't know. You say it's established specifically to perpetuate the hostilities between Palestinians and Israelis.
The reason I say that is because it instituted a unique refugee status for Palestinians, which is passed down generation to generation, doesn't exist anywhere else. Anywhere else where refugees come and they are absorbed into a country, for example, the 850,000 refugees, Jewish refugees that fled the Arab world and came into Israel, became Israeli citizens. Not so with the Palestinians when they were kept as refugees in camps in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, in Jordan. The UNRWA system that was set up to perpetuate that refugee status.
What year was it set up?
1950. There's a great book by Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz called The War of Return that goes into detail, a lot of the motivation behind setting it up, and then UNRWA's track record. So a big part of it is setting up this perpetual refugee status, which is explained on the basis that once Israel is eradicated, the successive generations of refugees will be moved into Haifa and Jaffa and Herzliya, will be moved into Israeli cities once the Jews are pushed into the sea. That was the rhetoric in the 1950s, and that rhetoric has not changed in the UNRWA education system. That is, unfortunately, the central factor in what gave rise to what happened 12 months ago on the 7th of October. But it's also the fact that many of those who crossed the border, those young individuals who engaged in these atrocities, had never seen a Jew since 2005. There haven't been any in Gaza. The first Jews that they encountered were those that they raped and mutilated and tortured and burnt, slaughtered. And that should give us pause for thought, because what we have recently heard is that the solution, apparently, is to continue to ethnically cleanse Jews. The General Assembly resolution that was passed the week before last called for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Jerusalem and from the West Bank. So the international community, I think, has a great deal to answer for, not just in terms of the indoctrination, the perpetuation of that messaging through UNRWA, which is complicit in, but also through the incentivization to terror, the pay-for-slay salary system. And this is run by the so-called moderates in the West Bank, the Palestinian autonomy, but they pay the salaries of terrorists no matter what banner they coalesce under. So the leaders of the Nukhba force that planned these attacks, including Ali Qadi, who was released in the Gilad Shalit deal, he was paid a stipend by the Palestinian Authority on a monthly basis, which by all accounts enabled him to plan these attacks of the 7th of October for 2 years before. And these salaries are paid essentially on the basis of how many Jews these terrorists have been able to slaughter. They go up in relation to the severity of their crimes. The international community is complicit in that while it continues to fund the Palestinian Authority, while it does not demand an end to this obscene policy that encourages terrorism. So if we think about indoctrination to terror and incentivization to terror and step back and look at the international community's complicity in this, I think there are a number of things that we need to be honest about, recognise as significantly contributing factors to the 7th of October, if there's going to be any hope of properly understanding the situation and seeking to ensure it doesn't reoccur.
There's a terrible paradox or irony that when you speak about these international organizations like the UN, ICC, ICJ, that all created in the wake of the Holocaust and now seem to be working against Jews. It's quite astonishing. And not only that, we were talking earlier about Lebanon, to hear Emmanuel Macron, the French president, basically coming out against Israel. It seems so bizarre, whilst at the same time people are celebrating Nasrallah's death in Syria because Hezbollah sided with Assad. But sorry, maybe that's a...
Well, in Lebanon too, I think that's a hugely important point, because what Macron and others were doing wasn't just betraying Israel, it was also betraying the Lebanese people. Hezbollah has taken over that country. It has continued to oppress Lebanese, the Christian Lebanese in particular, and it has turned the south of that country into a terror infrastructure, very similar to Hamas. It is using civilian homes as rocket launch sites, as weapons caches, and as part of its terror infrastructure. The Dakhya that was targeted in the strike that eliminated Hassan Nasrallah is in a civilian neighborhood in the south of Lebanon. So when you hear international leaders making, I think, incredibly misguided comments like that, one really fears, I think, for the ordinary Lebanese civilians who need to be supported, just like the civilians in Iran who are subject to the Islamic regime there. There is so much that is not discussed. The desire for those people, ordinary civilians living in the Middle East, who have been oppressed by these Islamist terrorist networks, they are the ones that really need support. And at the moment, it only seems to be Israel that is acting in their interests in the Middle East. And by all accounts, we've heard that a great deal of the intelligence coups that Israel has been able to achieve has been as the result of cooperation, coordination by Iranians and Lebanese on the ground that want to rid themselves of these terrorist overlords.
I know there's also hope I see in other nations like the Emiratis, but perhaps we'll try and maybe end this conversation in a hopeful way, and we'll come back to that. But before we move, let's just continue with the international situation and or rather international law on these multinational organizations. How do you explain that they have turned on Israel? Why is that? Like you mentioned, the General Assembly, they use very much anti-Israel language, occupied force, and if you read it, they're going along with the International Court of Justice ruling from earlier this year. How is it that these organizations have turned on Israel? Why do you think that is? And why do you see, for example, you mentioned UNRWA and the funding of UNRWA and the Labour government and David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, restarting payment towards UNRWA, British taxpayer money towards UNRWA. How is it they've not understood what is plain to see, like you've just described, the corruption of these organizations?
So I wish I could put my finger on the answer. My impression is that there's a lack of willingness to see, because the information is out there. I mean, it's just like the aid supplies that have been going into Gaza. COGAT, a unit of the IDF that is responsible for the treatment of civilians in armed conflict, the provision of humanitarian assistance to them, have put out daily updates of the amount of aid going in. It's far in excess of what the World Food Programme estimates is required to feed the entire population of Gaza. And yet we've got, even the British government continuing this canard that Israel isn't doing enough to facilitate aid into Gaza. So the information is there. I don't understand why there's willful blindness to it. In relation to the broader international war against Israel, well, this is nothing new. It has been the work of decades. Even in 1975, the UN came up with this obscene resolution, Zionism is racism. But there is a lot of groundwork that was done for that at the Durban conference. And that groundwork has been the work of armies of NGOs that are targeting Israel with these libels. You're absolutely right when you say the mechanisms that were set up after the Holocaust in response to the Jewish experience of being exterminated for being Jews. Those very mechanisms have now been inverted and used to target the Jewish population, not just in Israel, but I would suggest the diaspora also. We can come into some of the reasons for that. But it is part of the fabric of the United Nations. It is built in. For example, in the standing agenda item that exists at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Agenda Item 7 only targets Israel. It is built into the numbers of resolutions at the General Assembly that target Israel, which are far more than the rest of the world put together. The important thing to recognize is that this is a political war, right? These are not legal resolutions. The only resolutions passed at the United Nations that have legal validity are passed specifically under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter at the United Nations Security Council. But all the resolutions targeting Israel at the Security Council passed under Chapter 6, so they're political resolutions, they're not legally binding. And then,
sorry, what is the difference between Chapter 7 and Chapter 6?
Chapter 7 resolutions are the strongest legal tool in the UN legislative box. They have to explicitly state that they are made under Chapter 7 because often they mandate member states to take on particular action, either sanctions or sometimes military action. So, for example, the UN Security Council ordering Iraq to get out of Kuwait. That was a Chapter 7 resolution, and there followed the mandate to take military action thereafter. Just after September 11th, there was a UN Security Council resolution mandating that member states take action against terror financing. They create legally binding obligations on member states of the UN. It's very difficult to pass a resolution like that has legal teeth. You know how the UN works, and having to get, especially the permanent five, those that have a veto at the United Nations to sign on to a resolution is not straightforward. So it perhaps doesn't surprise us that there aren't many resolutions that are passed that actually are legally binding. And in relation to Israel, there are none. But people often reflect on the political resolutions and say, oh, well, the UN says, as though that has some sort of force in international law. I think a big part of the reason that this war against Israel in the international pseudo-legal arena, and specifically the international political arena, is being so successful is often because of the misrepresentations of international law that are being advanced by it. The mechanisms that are set up the United Nations. Let's not forget, this is not a democratic institution. You know, one dictator has the whole voters, the whole of Germany. And there is an inbuilt majority against Israel at the United Nations, which is why these political resolutions against Israel are passed with such ease. The questions as to the international legal institutions, I think, are harder to answer. Here we have an international legal system that has been hijacked. And I think that the consequences for that are not just problematic for Israel, but for any country that actually prizes rule of law and has a commitment to the international legal order. And we have seen this farce playing out at the International Court of Justice. It's another example of using the frameworks set up after the Holocaust to target Jews. South Africa's allegation of genocide against Israel, entirely baseless, an inversion of the factual reality, but it is very calculated. It is accusing the victims of genocide, not just the Jewish victims of genocide in the Holocaust, but the victims of acts of genocide on the 7th of October. It is accusing the victims of the very crimes that were committed against them. And that is calculated. And it is also part of this, PR exercise against Israel in the international legal arena. I remember just after the first provisional measures order was passed. This was on the 26th of January. Again, it was an order of the highest court at the UN, the International Court of Justice, which was completely misrepresented in the international press. The suggestion was that Israel had been found plausibly guilty of genocide, or that there was a plausible case of genocide. None of that was true. But it took the former president of the International Court of Justice, who drafted that order, to come out on BBC on Hard Talk to clarify all of these misrepresentations. And I was saying at the outset, just read the order, see what it says. What is being broadcast is not accurate. The court had ultimately only said that the case that South Africa brought plausibly fell under the Genocide Convention, that it was invoking plausible rights, so that there was a potential case that fell for legal consideration, given that both Israel and South Africa are parties to the Genocide Convention. That was the basis upon which South Africa advanced this allegation. I was on South Africa's version of the BBC just after this provisional measures order was passed, and my counterpart said, "Isn't it wonderful? Now we can finally use Israel and genocide in the same sentence and nobody can tell us otherwise." Now that to me was a clear indication, not just of South Africa's motivation here in making this obscene claim against Israel, but also in the fact that they'd been successful. That Overton window had shifted, right? Suddenly it was acceptable to talk about Israel and genocide in the same sentence. And it didn't matter what the International Court of Justice had actually said in that provisional measures order. It didn't matter that the merit stage of this is still far off, and by all accounts, South Africa doesn't have any evidence to present to substantiate its claim against Israel at the court. None of that matters because the international discourse has shifted. And we've seen very similar things at play at the other international court that is targeting Israel at the moment, the International Criminal Court. This is a court that also sits in The Hague in the Netherlands, but it is not a court that deals with states. It deals with individuals of criminal responsibility.
And they've decided, or they've judged that Netanyahu is a war criminal.
Not yet.
They haven't yet.
So it's again the reportage on this is completely disconnected from the realities. What we've had so far is the current prosecutor at the ICC, advancing arrest warrant applications for the Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, and he has doubled down on his efforts to get pre-trial chamber 1 that is due to rule on whether to issue these arrest warrants. He's asked them to speed up. They have taken submissions, input from states and from international organisations and organisations such as UK Lawyers for Israel, which we've highlighted a number of difficulties with what's happening at the ICC. One of them, of course, is the fact that this court has no jurisdiction over Israel or over Israelis. Israel is not a signatory to the Rome Statute that set up this court. Neither is the United States. There are reasons for that. One of them is that it was clear at the drafting of the Rome Statute that this was going to be a political court that went after Israel. The manipulation of the wording of some of the crimes, it was intended to seek to criminalise Jews living in Judea and Samaria. That was clear at the time. Israel didn't join the court. So the court has no jurisdiction to be pursuing this investigation. The court certainly has no jurisdiction to be considering arrest warrants where there has been a complete failure to address the principle of complementarity at the court. Now, complementarity requires that the court won't intervene where a state that actually has criminal jurisdiction to pursue investigations and potential prosecutions is willing and able to do so. Israel's in the middle of a war still against Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations in Gaza. The idea that the prosecutor has even facilitated the opportunity for Israel to consider the allegations that he is raising, let alone go through the processes, there's no one that will credibly suggest that Israel's legal system isn't robust, perhaps one of the most robust in the international community, and the adherence that they provide to international law, the respect that the Israeli legal system gives to international law is unprecedented. The UK doesn't operate like that. The US certainly doesn't operate like that. The notion that Israel cannot be trusted to conduct thorough investigations is simply not a credible one. And anyone that is advancing that position clearly hasn't spent time investigating the Israeli judicial system and processes and the Military Advocate General Corps, that is the legal department of the IDF, are already in the process of many disciplinary investigations. So complementarity clearly hasn't been considered here by the prosecutor, and that's another abject failure. We've raised, UK Lawyers for Israel, the issues on jurisdiction, the issues on complementarity, but we've also written to set out that the public summary of Prosecutor Khan's arrest warrant application is false. That every phrase of every sentence that he has included is incorrect. And that also triggers professional obligations of any member of the bar putting forward incorrect information to a court to substantiate a case. Needs to consider that, needs to reflect on that, needs to correct that information, especially if subsequent information has come to light to prove that it is incorrect. We haven't seen any of that. And so I step back and say, well, what's happened to the International Criminal Court, the court that so many had such hopes of, especially after the Holocaust, of providing accountability for international criminals, war criminals. The reputation that this court has had has suffered significantly. Its success rate is abysmal. It's mostly focused on African prosecutions and prosecuting African defendants.
Has it ever been used for good? Is there any point in history where it did something that we might say, oh, that was worthwhile?
I'd say that a number of the prosecutions that have been celebrated that have been successful were probably a net good, but they have been few and far between. And as a result, there was an investigation, a very comprehensive assessment as to the court's ability to use the obscene amount of money that had been given to pursue its founding principles. And it had been found wanting. And it strikes me that the manner in which these arrest warrants have been pursued against Israel's democratically elected leadership, including a press conference, including an interview with Christian Amanpour, and this public summary of the arrest warrant applications, which is relatively unprecedented. Mostly these warrants are sought in secret so that the individuals subject to them aren't aware, and that they might travel to a jurisdiction which might then execute that warrant. Not so here. And the PR circus that has surrounded it really leaves me with the impression that this is the court seeking to rehabilitate itself, seeking to show it doesn't just go after African defendants, but actually it's going after the world's punching bag, the Jewish state. And no one's going to criticize it in those circumstances.
I was going to ask, if it knows it's not its jurisdiction, then what exactly is it doing then? And that seems to sort of virtue signaling sort of...
Well, the prosecutor has claimed that it does have jurisdiction, and there are various convoluted ways in which each Fatou Bensouda, the previous prosecutor, and now Karim Khan have sought to justify that. In both respects, I would respectfully suggest that they misapply international law, and the only explanation I can find is that it is politics that is leading this procedure, and then there is some relatively poor legal analysis put forward to seek to justify it. I mean, one of the examples, that's quite a long, it's quite a big claim for me to make, so let me just give you a little bit of colour as to why I say that. One of the reasons that Fatou Bensouda in 2021, when she was seeking to open an investigation into Israel despite this absence of jurisdiction, she addressed the principle of uti possidetis juris, which we can come on to in a little bit more detail maybe.
What does that mean?
And how uti possidetis juris is the rule that determines the borders of newly emerging states at their moment of independence. It's universally applied. It's a default rule. And the idea behind its development, which the International Court of Justice recognised in the Burkina Faso Mali case in the 1980s, the idea behind its development was to provide clean lines, to promote stability and certainty, and to prevent fratricidal struggles. And this rule applied in the 19th century when the Spanish withdrew from South America. The idea was to prevent a vacuum at the withdrawal of the colonial power, so to prevent a terra nullius arising. It was applied in Asia and in Africa. It was applied at the dissolution of the former communist federations and to every state that emerged from a mandate, which you and your listeners may know Israel did. But it was not the only one. The Kingdom of Iraq came out of the mandate for Mesopotamia. Lebanon came out of a French mandate. So from every state that emerged from a mandate, this is the rule that dictates what that new state's borders are. And the rule says that the new state inherits, takes on the pre-existing administrative lines of whatever unit preceded it. Now, in Israel's case, when the British withdrew from the British mandate in 1948 and David Ben-Gurion declared independence on the 14th of May, the only lines that were in play, the only lines that were relevant, were the pre-existing administrative lines of the British Mandate. Israel was the only state to emerge. According to this default rule of uti possidetis juris, Israel automatically takes on those pre-existing administrative lines as its internationally recognised borders. Now, I don't have any maps with me, but the British Mandate administrative line after the severance of Transjordan, which later became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, the line ran all the way down the Jordan River to the Red Sea. And it includes East Jerusalem and the West Bank. This puts the lie to this canard of occupation, which you referenced a little earlier in our discussion. And it indicates that from the get-go in 1948, as a matter of default, universal, customary international law, that was Israeli sovereign territory. And what happened in 1948? There's a war of annihilation launched against Israel, and Jordan occupies the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Israel. It ethnically cleanses it of its Jews.
So I've understood it differently, is that the United Nations split up the land then, and I had assumed that which were different lines to what you're describing, right?
So that's incorrect. What you're referring to is the partition resolution of 1947.
Yes.
You're absolutely right that the UN put forward alternative lines. This was a political resolution, as I mentioned.
Also thought that the Jews in the region had accepted the United Nations lines.
So, one step at a time. Yeah. You're right that there were partition resolution lines put forward by the UN as part of this political resolution. We talked about General Assembly resolutions, not legally binding. It was a recommendation. It was a recommendation that was never implemented. Why? Because albeit that the Jewish community pre-state, called the Yishuv, albeit that the Yishuv accepted that proposal, the local Arab population, the surrounding Arab states never did. So it was never implemented. Unlike partition with India-Pakistan, which was implemented, that partition resolution was never put into practice. So what's the default? The default is uti possidetis juris, absent any agreement to the contrary. Many people say, well, the UN created Israel. Also incorrect. The UN doesn't create states. Any state is created by a declaration of independence. That is what the International Court of Justice refers to as the critical date. You take a photograph of the territory, a snapshot of the territory on the critical date to work out where those administrative lines are that become the borders. That's what the International Court of Justice talked about when it talked about the development of this rule, this default rule of uti possidetis juris. But the important thing also to recognise is that these are the lines that were referenced in every single agreement subsequently. So there was no alternative agreement which would replace the application of, or displace the application of uti possidetis juris. But the armistice agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan in 1949, they don't recognise any borders because Egypt and Jordan didn't recognise Israel in any borders at the time. They didn't recognise the legitimacy of Israel's presence there. But they reference back to the British Mandate boundaries because those were the only boundaries in play. The peace agreements between Egypt and Israel.
So they recognised it as a British mandate without it being a British mandate.
They talk about the British mandate boundaries as lines that they reference back to because they're actually demarcated. There was sometimes there were disagreements about where the markers were, but in terms of lines on a map, the administrative lines of the British mandate were those that the parties, the relevant parties, were able to reference back to. Mm-hmm. And so they are referenced in the armistice agreements. They're also referenced in the peace agreements. The latest one with Jordan, between Israel and Jordan in 1994. So these are the only lines in play. Now, Israel doesn't have to stake a claim to this territory. Israel doesn't even have to control that territory because it was immediately invaded in 1948 when it declared independence, and immediately Jordan seized some of the West Bank and then increased its hold on that territory. But international law doesn't work like that. It's not actually about facts on the ground. It's about what the default rules are and what the international community has recognised the rule or the principle being. So you cannot have a general rule and an exception for a country you don't like very much, or you have some political or ideological opposition to. That's not how any respectable legal system can operate. And as lawyers, we often look to alternative examples to understand how rules apply in other contexts. So one example that many people are now very familiar with is that of Ukraine. Ukraine's borders followed uti possidetis juris. That is why there's a general consensus that Russia has occupied Crimea from Ukraine. But if Ukraine were to recover Crimea from Russia in the current war, in the same way that Israel recovered the West Bank from Jordan and East Jerusalem, from Jordan in 1967, when Israel recovered that territory, would anyone claim that Ukraine was occupying Crimea from Russia if that occurred? Of course not. But here we've got the complete inverse. So when Israel recovered that territory from Jordan in 1967, it did a couple of things. The first thing was that it applied its law, administration and jurisdiction in full to East Jerusalem. It reunited that city. And the foreign secretary at the time in Israel, Abba Eban, writes to the UN Secretary General and he says, this is not annexation, because you cannot annex what is your own sovereign territory. Israel didn't apply its law, administration and jurisdiction in full to the West Bank. Instead, it applied a temporary administration, which included some of the aspects of the laws of occupation, some of the framework. Why? Because under the law, under the sort of received wisdom at the time, which was this land for peace framework, the expectation was that Israel would give Jordan some of the West Bank to facilitate a peace agreement in due course. So a temporary administration was instituted until that could be effected.
Is that why you use the occupation there? Is that what you're...
Well, I don't use that word.
Right.
Because...
When you say laws of occupation, what are you referring
to? The framework of the laws of occupation developed in international law to provide a system where one state occupied the territory of another sovereign entity. So the idea was, until there was a peace agreement or another war in which that territory was recovered, the... status of that territory would sort of be kept in abeyance, and the occupying power would be there would be a framework by which they would administer that territory, providing for the needs of the local population, but not changing the character of it too substantially. In a nutshell, but that applies between sovereign states. So when one state occupies the territory of another sovereign state, now Israel borrowed aspects of that framework for its temporary administration of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, when it recovered this territory from Jordan. And that has certainly facilitated, and it's also a reason many Israelis use the term occupation, I think, misguidedly, because, and it's been applied now as a concept, in a political concept, but it is not a proper use of the term in international law, which applies in those specific contexts, but also that it applies... the better terminology I would suggest in the context of the West Bank is disputed territory. And that reflects what has happened after 1967. So when Israel recovered that territory, first we had the administrative framework, but then subsequently you've also got the Oslo Accords. Now the Oslo Accords didn't change the underlying status of that territory. Ultimately, it's still, according to uti possidetis juris, those lines haven't been displaced. But what it did do is create the Palestinian Authority, and it created a Palestinian autonomy. And it divided the West Bank up into areas A, B, and C. And in area A and B, which is where the majority of Palestinian Arabs live, the Palestinian Authority has self-governance. They have self-determination. We've seen some of the consequences of that in terms of how, terror organizations have flourished even in the West Bank. But one of the things that's keeping that at bay is Israel's security cooperation with the Palestinian Authority. That stops Hamas taking over violently in the same way that they took over the Gaza Strip in 2007 and threw their opposition Fatah members off the roofs of buildings. But that's a delicate situation, and at the moment, Hamas has certainly been gaining a foothold in certain parts of the West Bank, and there are continual Israeli security operations there as a result of that. But albeit that this international agreement, which was endorsed by the international community and has subsequently now just been torn up by both Security Council resolutions, by General Assembly resolutions, by the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. Winston, you referred to it as a ruling earlier, and I didn't pick up on it. It's an opinion. It doesn't have any legal status, but many, many people are referring it to it as a ruling. We can come on to some of the implications of it. Sure. Absolutely. This international agreement, the Oslo Accords, has been thoroughly torn up now by the international community. I can't see there's any incentive on Israel to come to the negotiating table and sign an agreement in future if they're not worth the paper they're written on. So the message that has been sent to Israel is an extremely troubling one. But ultimately, these political developments haven't changed the status of the territory. And it puts the lie to occupation, which is critical. It also puts the lie to this canard of illegal settlements. Again, the received wisdom, right, is that Israel is building illegal settlements. Now, quite apart from the political implications of this or the practical repercussions, I don't believe that settlements were an impediment to peace. They certainly weren't an impediment to Israel's withdrawal from Gaza. They weren't an
You don't think they're adversarial? So even my experience and in that region, in West Bank, is that for me, I find that the settlements, even as a Zionist, I find that a little bit provocative. I mean, there is a lot of land already within that Israel have that they can build on, but to build there in that region seems provocative to me. Do you think I'm wrong to feel? I mean, it's maybe a feeling more than it's rational.
I do think it's wrong, but I'd love to explore it with you because I don't think you're alone in that. And I wonder to what extent this is predicated on the false representations that this is not Israeli land or this is land that has been taken away from someone else. There are... In terms of the temporary administration that Israel instituted, it recognised the existing legal frameworks for property law, which include a real mixture of Ottoman law, some aspects of what Jordan implemented during its own occupation, in terms of the custodian of enemy property, and what Israel has subsequently instituted in terms of planning regulations, in accordance with the Oslo Accords. There were big misrepresentations, both factual and legal, about the issue of the settlements. I mean, if we step back and just look at it from a moral perspective for a moment, this notion that Jews shouldn't live in certain areas simply because they're Jews is utterly repugnant. So on that basis, someone's going to have to explain to me what is provocative about Jews living in Judea and Samaria, about Jewish communities being established there. Especially when I've, explained all of the misrepresentations about the status of the territory. But on a factual basis, there are organisations in the West Bank monitoring illegal building. Some of it's being funded by the EU. And it's in Area C, and it is often at the insistence of the Palestinian Authority also. In flagrant breach of the Oslo Accords. There is illegal building in the West Bank, and it is being done for political purposes, but it's the inverse. It's actually the Palestinians that are instituting it.
So what are they doing? What's the illegal building that they're doing?
Well, one example is that on an area that is not designated for building in terms of planning and zoning and planning, the first thing that will go up as a temporary structure, as a sort of porter cabin, is supposedly a school. In the middle of nowhere, not next to any community. But it's important that it's a school because of the optics of when that is removed. According to planning law, if you build illegally here in London, I know because it was part of my practice as a barrister, the council will come and the bulldozers will come. Right? That is what happens in a country where there is rule of law. But here, increasingly the government isn't enforcing planning regulations because these are the optics of taking down a porter cabin with an EU plaque on it are extremely problematic. So that is the first land grab, if you will, that is set out, and then they'll bring generators and water because this isn't next to any particular community. It's set up as an outpost, as part of this kind of political process of establishing facts on the ground. So again, we're faced with the reality, which is actually the complete inverse of what is being put out in terms of international discourse. And I can completely understand why your initial gut reaction to what are called Israeli settlements, I mean, even the language on this is charged, would be negative. And that's because of all of the misinformation that's associated with it. If we think about the potential implications on a peaceful resolution, I mean, these are communities that are being built in Area C of the Oslo Accords zoning, that was kept under full Israeli administration. And that's where the vast majority of Jews in the West Bank live, because they have been ethnically cleansed from the rest of it. There is a demand by the Palestinian Authority that there be no Jews. No Jews in the Palestinian Authority, no Jews in a Palestinian state, any future Palestinian state. It's extraordinary. Now, yesterday, we are told that the IDF eliminated in Gaza an individual called Aziz Salah. Aziz Salah became notorious because of an image that was at the centre of the Second Intifada. And it underpins why it is that the West Bank that is under Palestinian Authority control is free of Jews. In 2000, 2 Israeli reservists lost their way. They found themselves by mistake in Ramallah, and they went to the local police station looking for help, looking for assistance to get out of there. They didn't find assistance at the local police station. Instead, they were lynched. They were lynched, they were cut open, they were mutilated, their livers, by all reports, were eaten by their attackers. And Aziz Salah became so famous because he held up his hands covered in blood to the window, to the baying crowd below. And that image went around the world and became a defining image of the Second Intifada. It is remarkable that nearly 25 years later, he was, by all accounts, eliminated in Gaza yesterday. But that image was emblazoned on the minds of many Israelis, and it's one of the reasons that there are big red signs outside of Palestinian Authority-controlled areas in the West Bank warning any Israeli citizens from going in. It's unlawful because of the consequences that will befall them, that befell these 2 reservists in 2000. They say Israeli citizens, they don't actually mean Israeli citizens, they mean Jews, because Arab Israelis, which are 20% of the population, come and go as they please. They are not subject to the same genocidal threats. But unfortunately, you are faced with a situation where in Palestinian-controlled areas, Gaza, clearly we know, and in the West Bank, that land has been ethnically cleansed of Jews. It has been made Judenrein, which is a phrase that we're aware of the Second World War. You mentioned the Jewish experience there. It is very pertinent to what Israel is having to encounter today. Having said all of that, if we were to just give for one moment the benefit of the doubt that, Israeli settlements pose some sort of, difficulty to establishing a peaceful solution, which I cannot accept, because there was no issue with withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, despite that there were Israeli settlements there. There were communities that were uprooted.
No issue as in... Well, it was done.
It was done, ultimately. So of course, there were issues internally.
It could be done in the West Bank.
On principle, the principle has been established. It was also what happened in the Sinai when Israel withdrew from the Sinai, and that went to Egypt.
But there weren't Israelis living in Sinai, were there?
There were communities that were evacuated in the same way.
Right.
Now, of course, the scale and the level of Jewish communities living in Judea and Samaria is far more significant, and also this being, part of the Jewish heartland.
Do we know how many roughly are living there?
I'm not going to hazard a guess, just in case I get it.
Hundreds of thousands, though.
Well, it depends. It depends which parts you're talking about, and it depends. I'm sure that there are different estimates of them.
Sure.
There's a far more substantial presence there, but then there was a not insignificant presence of Jews living there before they were kicked out by the Jordanians. Kicked out, putting it mildly. Ethnically cleansed in 1948. So many of those original communities returned when Israel recovered that territory in 1967. But say for one moment we give the benefit of the doubt that this is a problem. Surely building settlements then would bring the Palestinian Authority to the table sooner rather than later. If there was an encroaching position here, if it was making peace harder. If think about it as a sand timer, if you will. If the building of settlements means that the sand timer is running out, come to negotiate now rather than.
That's my point, that it's provocative.
Well, I'm saying I don't accept the premise of that. But if that were the case, then it would be an incentive to seek peace sooner rather than later. I think the bigger problem here, the bigger problem is that the Palestinian Authority have no incentive to seek a peaceful solution. Mahmoud Abbas, who's in his 19th year of his 4-year term as the Palestinian Authority president, relies on security cooperation with Israel, as I mentioned earlier, to prevent a Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip in the same way that they took over the West Bank. He also relies on the outside enemy that is Israel, just like any despot, right? They need an outside source of all of the problems in society to maintain his political control as a corrupt leader. But he also relies on international donations, which flood in as a result of the perpetuation of the conflict. So what incentive does Abbas have to seek a solution? None. And you see that in the education that is meted out to Palestinians in the West Bank, just as in Gaza, and also in the fact that he pays the salaries of terrorists. And that he'll come to the UN and essentially give these grandiose speeches claiming victimhood, and at the same time be encouraging terrorism at home and not provide for the basics as he is required to for the Palestinians. He has no interest in taking the rubbish out.
Do you think the same could be said about Israel in reverse? I mean, you've said that a two-state solution is being called a two-state delusion now. One might say, why would Israel, particularly if they've made these huge gains? I mean, again, we'll see what the response is after the Iranian launch of ballistic missiles. But are they in a position where why would they want to seek any sort of two-state solution? Or
well, I think the real question that has to be posed is why generations of Israelis who have seen every concession, every security concession made lead to blood on the streets, why they would believe that next time would be different. Only a crazy person can be expected to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different outcome. So that's the first question that I think you'll have to ask as to, how on earth to get Israelis on board with putting their faith in that process again. But ultimately, Israel has a track record of engaging in that peace-building exercise because peace has always been the ultimate goal. It's what's taught in Israeli schools and has been since the founding of the state. And it is what is yearned for. You see it in the films that are produced. You see it in the music culture. Every aspect, even like the Nova Festival, which was brutally attacked by Hamas on the 7th of October. It was a peace festival. There were many reasons that underpin its location so close to the border with Gaza. Also, the communities that were attacked in the south were those at the forefront, at the vanguard of pursuing cooperation with the citizens of the south of citizens of the south of Israel, pursuing cooperation with those in Gaza, water desalination projects, driving Gazans to hospital if they were coming for treatment in Israel. That sort of engagement, and they bore the brunt of those attacks. So I think in the last 12 months, many of Israelis have come to the realization that absent a change in the indoctrination towards terrorism, there is nothing to talk about because the Palestinians and their leadership have made it clear. They say this all the time in Arabic to their own people. We are seeking a state to use it as a platform to eradicate the rest of Israel. Peace isn't on the agenda there. Now, I think that this two-state delusion, as you've also referred to it now, is one of the key reasons that the international community is perpetuating the Palestinian suffering. The best indicators of hope and optimism that I have had, and I've visited Ramallah, I've gone to venture capital startup funds looking to create Silicon Valley, looking to create a Palestinian middle class with a stake in society, economic cooperation with Israelis, and build on that. Peace is not going to come from a piece of paper and a tick box, scenario kind of set out by the Americans, or a handshake on the lawn in the Rose Garden of the White House, and an American president saying, "Oh, see, I fixed it." Peace comes from building people-to-people cooperation, as we saw with the Abraham Accords, and lasting networks. Economics plays a significant role in that. And absent that, there's another aspect of this which is critical, and that is an honest approach to the origins of this conflict and to the factors that are perpetuating it and to the legal position. Because we started to talk about how legal terms have been misrepresented, how international law is being abused to advance this political war against Israel. And that's critical. People are talking about this war in terms of 7 fronts, that Israel is fighting Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis, Hezbollah, all of these Iranian proxies. Israel is fighting them on 7 fronts, but people are forgetting an 8th front here, and that is the international community, the international media, and critically international law. Mm-hmm. And lawfare, which is an abuse of legal processes, of international law and of international legal institutions, is providing a false, an inversion and a false basis of challenge against Israel. And until we can be honest about the legal origins and the legal status of the territory and the realities of international law, then I think all of these prospects of pursuing some sort of peaceful solution are going to be ultimately hampered.
Forgive me for being pessimistic, but given how ingrained the origins of the conflict, the conception of the Nakba versus the War of Independence, and how different the narratives are. If you ask anyone who's anti-Israel, they will say there was ethnic cleansing and Israel.
Those canards and lies need to be addressed squarely, absolutely, fully, before we can advance.
But are you actually hopeful that that's possible?
Without that being possible, there's nothing to talk about here. So I don't think hope or optimism necessarily, comes into it. If that's not possible, then this is not going away. And the fact of the matter is that we saw it in Egypt. Within weeks, the crowds in Cairo went from shouting "Idbach al-Yahud," kill the Jews, to cheering for Begin and Sadat. And those 2 leaders ultimately made a peace which isn't perfect. Egypt has been responsible for turning a blind eye to tunnels under the Rafah crossing across the border. People forget that Gaza shares a border with Egypt as well as Israel, right? And Hamas has been able to build up its terror infrastructure with Iranian weaponry for 16 years. With those tunnels, I was on the ground in Gaza last month and I saw them with my own eyes. There had been 200 tunnels found so far.
You went to the Rafah border?
No, I went into Gaza. I went into Rafah itself and I went all the way along the Philadelphia corridor. I was there with a military expert delegation of very senior former officers from 6 NATO states. And we went in with the 162nd Division, the IDF, a few days before they had recovered the 6 bodies of the hostages who were murdered in cold blood.
I'll note also that as we speak, there are still 100 hostages in Gaza.
Over 100. We don't know how many of those are still alive. The efforts to recover them, I think, have been substantially hampered by a lot of the international discourse that we have heard. That discourse that gives succor to Hamas, criticism of Israel's approach and conduct to the war in Gaza, encouragement of Israel to make further concessions to this internationally prescribed terrorist organization, Hamas, that has refused to come to the negotiating table, that has made many outrageous and unreasonable demands, and even when those were agreed to by Israel, has broken the agreements. That the hostage recovery deal in November, which I'm not sure if you remember, but the ceasefire fell apart on the 1st of December. Hamas refused to honour its agreement to provide further female women and child hostages, and then started firing on Israel. And yet, the world and
the media wouldn't let you give that, wouldn't give you that impression whatsoever.
Well, certainly not. In fact, if you listen to some reports, you'd think Netanyahu is holding the hostages in his own basement. It's extraordinary, and the free pass that this internationally prescribed terrorist organisation has given in relation to these unspeakable crimes that is committed is extraordinary. But I digress.
Well, I want to come back to media.
Yes,
we'll come back to that.
Well, I was on the ground in Gaza and I saw those tunnels. I was in one which was bigger than this room, and there was soot on the walls because vehicles were going backwards and forwards right under an Egyptian army command post. right? The notion that the Egyptians here had no idea what was going on is simply not credible. But this all arose from an understanding or an explanation that despite the fact that it's not a perfect peace between Israel and Egypt, it has held. And one wouldn't have thought that that was possible if you listened to the Egyptian population shortly before that peace agreement was entered into. We've also seen the Abraham Accords come out of a transformation in the local population's attitude towards Israel in those respective countries. And the UAE in particular has done tremendous work on de-radicalization, on addressing textbooks and indoctrination against Jews. So I think it is possible, but it requires being honest about the fundamental contributions and causes of this ongoing conflict. It requires a complete change from the international community's perspective with respect to indoctrination and incentivization to terror. And it requires us to be honest about the false narratives, the Nakba included, the origins of Israel, Israel's approach to the Arab communities. You do not have a country that adheres to international law, in fact, goes way above the requirements of international law in armed conflict, as Israel does. And in so many respects, what it has done for the Palestinians far exceeds what the West has done for them. And the Arab world has simply kept them as pawns in this war against Israel, has kept them in refugee camps, as I mentioned earlier, in Jordan, in Egypt, in Syria and Lebanon for generations. Those Arabs that stayed in 1948, which also puts the lie to this notion that there was ethnic cleansing, they are now 20% of the population, the only free Arabs in the Middle East. When I worked at the Supreme Court for the late Chief Justice Miriam Naor, I also worked under Salim Gibran, an Arab justice. And he put both a Jewish Israeli president, former and former prime minister behind bars. The notion that there is inequality in Israel is, I think, put to, the lie is put to that, and it's clear that for anyone who actually visits Israel and sees the full part that Arabs take in Israeli society, that they will be clear about that. But you get international NGOs like Human Rights Watch advancing these canards of, apartheid by misrepresenting both what goes on inside Israel, but also what goes on across that region. So, for example, the Human Rights Watch report and also Amnesty International jumped on this bandwagon. They talked about the populations between the river and the sea. They completely ignored the Palestinian Authority, autonomy, the self-governance that they have, and they also ignored the rights that Israeli Arabs have as citizens of Israel. So all of that needs to be addressed, and that is no small task. The misrepresentations, the false information, and all of this false narrative, which I think ultimately has to be put down to anti-Semitism. There's no other way to explain the volume of misinformation which is accepted without challenge. We've seen that across, the recent reports that have come out now about the BBC's approach to the conflict and its blatant reporting of misinformation, including Hamas propaganda and casualty statistics, sometimes without even attributing them to the Hamas-controlled health authorities, without providing any context. That's the tip of the iceberg, but all of that ultimately has to be addressed, of course, if there's going to be any positive advance to a better and improved future. And that has to be the driving force and at the core, improving the lives of ordinary Palestinians and not allowing them to be held hostage by their leadership.
So on the issue of media, as you say, we've seen consistently since the war began, total misinformation being spread, particularly, I've been watching it on BBC of all places. It's particularly startling to see. But this week we heard Dr. Andreas Craig, who works at King's College in London, spent 4 years at Qatar, saying constantly red lines have been crossed mostly by the Israelis, which is an astonishing thing for the BBC to have on. It seems, keeping in mind the BBC have a fact-checking arm of BBC Verify. How is it? And you have been going onto mainstream media taking on these sorts of people throughout. To someone who hasn't been paying attention or hasn't got an idea of the mainstream media bias, how would you describe it? How would you describe what's gone on since October 7th within this, starting with British mainstream media?
Well, firstly, at its essence, it's not new. The volume and the magnitude and the consistent barrage, if you will, of that misinformation is unprecedented because of what we've seen over the last 12 months. But it's not new. And already 10 years ago, I remember a series of essays by Matti Friedman, who worked for the Associated Press in Jerusalem and wrote about his experiences. He explained the editorial lines, the expectation that stories would be written which were not just critical of Israel, but also, sometimes they were entirely invented, and pursued an anti-Israel narrative because that's what sold newspapers. Ultimately, if it's Jews, it's news. If it bleeds, it leads. And everyone, when they arrived, very quickly caught on in the Jerusalem bureau that this was the only way that they were going to be able to advance their journalistic careers. That's one aspect of it. Another is that more recently we're seeing, the bookers of media interviews, if you will, that I have engaged with. They're extremely young. Many of them get their news, their history, their politics from TikTok. So one certainly feeds the other in terms of the misinformation and the false narratives that are being expounded. But we also have a culture that has emerged where, I'll give you this one example. If you remember the Al-Ahli hospital strike.
Right at the beginning.
23rd of October.
Yeah.
So I was actually waiting on the line for the BBC at the time. They'd asked to interview me, and shortly before, a few minutes before the interview was due to start, I get a call from the deputy editor of the channel. Natasha, I'm so sorry, we're going to have to bump you in order to run with the rolling coverage. I'm sure you've been seeing it. There's, breaking news. I said, what are you talking about? Now more than ever, you need me because I'm watching your coverage and you're accusing Israel of an airstrike. I was watching reports already at that stage that this was the result of a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that fell short. And I raised this with him and he said, I've not seen this on any of the wires. Well, I had. So that in and of itself begs the question. But I said, okay, we'll put that aside. Let's analyse what we know and what we don't know. We know, as a matter of course, that Israel does not target civilians or protected objects. Right? If it's hitting a hospital or a school or a mosque, it's because Hamas is using this as part of its terror infrastructure. It often provides warnings. We saw that with respect to the Al-Shifa hospital. It went in on a number of occasions. And here, nothing of that had been trailered. Right? But we know Israel doesn't just target hospitals. We know the proportionality exercises, the very careful legal analysis that goes into strikes. We know that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad keep weapons caches next to protected buildings like schools and hospitals, and we also know that their rockets frequently fall short in the Gaza Strip. In the last exchange with Palestinian Islamic Jihad a few years prior, the overall estimate was that a third of their rockets fell in the Gaza Strip. They were targeting Israeli civilian communities, but they fell short, and those rockets kill indiscriminately. There's no warning. There's no proportionality analysis. And when they fall, they're obviously, the civilians aren't in shelters because Hamas don't allow the civilians to be in shelters. They use them as human shields. And so those rockets that fall short kill indiscriminately, aid workers included. We know all of these things. And yet the BBC and others, but they were really leading the charge on this, was putting out this immediate knee-jerk reaction accusing Israel of having attacked that hospital. And the consequences of that around the Arab world were deadly. It encouraged rioting. It's certainly encouraging this false narrative. The response by the BBC, once it was proven not only that this was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket, but also that it didn't hit the hospital.
It was the car park.
It was the car park. And they showed a little crater in the car park thereafter. I mean, apart from anything else, the BBC have stringers in Gaza. They could have sent someone down the street to have a look at the hospital and see that it was still intact. Mm-hmm. None of this happened. What has happened to responsible journalism? The other aspect of this in terms of the casualty figures, that 500 killed in this supposed Israeli strike on a hospital that never occurred, that figure was never revised. For months afterwards, it was still being included in the casualty total, so completely invented. And it had also been touted by the BBC as part of their initial reporting coverage of this. So all of that is the background to the point that I was getting to, which is Jeremy Bowen's response when he was interviewed about these false reports. Did he regret it? And he said no. So that's what we're dealing with. And honestly, especially after the two reports, the Assassin report, which used artificial intelligence to identify at least 1,500 instances of breaches of the Charter, and the subsequent report where Danny Cohen...
Which Charter?
Oh, the BBC's Charter.
Oh, okay.
So it's supposed to act with due impartiality. It's supposed to report accurately. And then subsequently, the former head of BBC television, Danny Cohen, has authored a report. There was a very powerful foreword also included by Baroness Ruth Deitch, who's been responsible for BBC oversight in the past. None of this, I don't anticipate, is going to make much of a difference because the BBC seem impervious to this kind of criticism. And if at the end of this obscene sequence of events with respect to Al-Ahli, Jeremy Bowen can say, I don't regret our reporting on it, then I don't know what there is to discuss with respect to the BBC, I'm afraid.
Wow. To your earlier point about TikTok, there's been analysis done of content on TikTok, and there has been deliberate shutting down of anything pro-Israel and keeping up of anti-Israel, pro-Palestine content. And that's having a huge influence on young people across the world in this country. And so I think that observation about how these media companies work, it is young people who don't know the topics, certainly not like you do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so they get caught up in it. I want to ask about America. In some way, I had an earlier question about, which I asked about the international community, and in some way one can understand Israel has enemies, and so and we can understand why those enemies would target Israel. But America is supposed to be Israel's ally, as is Britain. What is your take on the Biden administrations? We've talked about Abraham Accords, maybe we'll come back to that, but that was obviously spearheaded by Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and that would be part of Trump's foreign policy. What is your take on the Biden-Kamala Harris? And I ask that because, of course, we've got a presidential election coming up, big implications. What's your take on Biden's policy and Blinken towards Israel throughout this war?
I think it's been unbelievably damaging. It's served to encourage not just Israel's enemies, but I reiterate that these are the enemies of Western civilization, Hamas, Iran. There is a reason that I think it was on the 15th of April, Iran struck Israel directly for the first time. It's used terror proxies for decades, but this was a direct strike by Iran against Israeli civilians. And it came on the back of weeks of very troubling rhetoric that we heard from the United States, including some sort of throwaway comment by President Biden, which was quite quickly, his team sought to walk it back, but the damage was done, where he referenced Israeli strikes as indiscriminate. I mean, that's palpably incorrect. It's also at odds with the legal assessment that America has indicated it has conducted, that Israel is in compliance with international humanitarian law in Gaza. Israel strikes discriminate between civilians and combatants. They target Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other terror infrastructure and terrorists, combatants. So we had that troubling rhetoric and also the mixed messaging. And we've seen that now in the last couple of days. Immediately after this subsequent strike that was conducted against Israel of, as you've said, ballistic missiles, America said there needs to be a severe response. There will be a severe response. And then suddenly, only today, the president was saying, okay, but that response is not going to include Iran's nuclear installations. Now, that mixed messaging that we've had for the last 12 months from America has a devastating impact. It really is probably the reason that there are still over 100 hostages in Gaza, because it encourages Hamas. It gives succor to Hamas. Just like, Hamas's strategy here is to use misinformation in the international media and the international discourse, to lie about casualty figures, to demonize Israel. the reason it's doing that is Hamas can't hope to win against Israel after the 7th of October. It inflicted the worst day of atrocities against the Jews since the Holocaust. That was its win. But since then, its only objective has been to survive in Gaza. And its only hope of being able to survive is international pressure against Israel. And when this American administration and then other leaders around the world criticize Israel, give succor to Hamas and seek to encourage Hamas, it thinks that it's winning. And the same is clear of Iran. I remember I had a difference of opinion on this in a parliamentary committee for the Business and Trade Committee. We were discussing arms embargoes, and Lord Phillips, who's former national security advisor, didn't see things my way. Everything that we've seen subsequently, I would suggest, proves that I am right about this. Because every time America flip-flops or indicates that it won't have Israel's back in its entirety, the situation in the region worsens. Mm-hmm. We actually saw that for in different contexts. I mean, if you think back to the Arab Spring, very early on, Obama had to make a choice. Did it stand by what was ostensibly an American ally, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, or did it allow chaos to take over? And that American administration also chose chaos. It abandoned its allies in the Middle East. Now, in many respects, that was very much the underlying framework for the Abraham Accords, because a weak America requires those countries that also feel threatened by Iran to band together. And that created incredible alliances between Israel and the Abraham Accords countries. But it was completely at odds with the received wisdom of previous American administrations. And there was an arrogance as well as an ignorance that informed that. I don't know if you recall, in 2016, the former Secretary of State, John Kerry, gave an interview as part of the Saban conference. And he said, "Mark my words, there will never be a separate peace between Israel and the Arab world without a resolution to the Palestinian issue." Now, that was proven to be entirely incorrect. Yeah. That whole worldview, which was very much part of the American security establishment, was proven to be false. Mm-hmm. But the pursuit
by the Abraham Accords,
and the potential for more, the potential really for peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia, or at least normalization, which many people say played a significant role in the timing of the 7th of October attacks. Yeah. But what we have seen, when you ask about America's approach here and American influence, unfortunately, is that misguided approach and that ignorance in so many respects by the American security establishment, I believe, has encouraged the enemies of Israel and America in the region, and has allowed terror networks to flourish. And one key example of this is with respect to this ridiculous Iran deal, which was pursued by the Obama administration, and it basically provided a framework for Iran to continue to fund its terror operations around the world. Mm-hmm. Now, the danger of a nuclear Iran isn't just that it uses its nuclear arsenal against Israel, as it has threatened to do so repeatedly. I mean, there's a countdown clock in Tehran to Israel's destruction. The Iranian regime make no secret of their intention here. But the real danger is what Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, this is not the Iranian people we're talking about, this is the terror regime that is holding them hostage. What the Iranian regime will do, the foremost state sponsor of terror in the world currently, what they will do with a nuclear umbrella, with immunization from Western responses to their acts of terrorism. And the other aspect of this that's important to remember are the hundreds of non-Israelis who have been slaughtered by Iranian proxies, including Hezbollah, American Marines, French, the attack in Buenos Aires, those victims recently, or the families of victims recently marked the 30-year anniversary of the AMAR bombings in Buenos Aires. all of Iran's attacks against Western civilization, not to mention the plots here in the UK that were foiled by security services, where Hezbollah operatives were stockpiling explosives to be used here on UK soil. This doesn't get the sort of coverage that it is really required. And I think all of it is undoubtedly being encouraged by America's, not every administration to be sure, but America's desire to appease as opposed to provide a strong deterrence. And deterrence in the Middle East is key.
Well, but not specifically America, I would say. It's kind of Biden and the neocon tradition, because Trump's version of this is completely different. So
the neocon tradition, though, is the complete opposite. It sees America, as far as, at least in terms of foreign policy, neoconservatism sees America as integral to defending international freedom and democratic values.
Okay, let me rephrase that then. The Democrat perceived wisdom, and this is what happened under Obama, as you already articulated, and picked up again, ignoring what Trump did by Biden, Blinken, Harris, is that they have this conception that for security in the Middle East, you need to have the Sunnis and Shia, the axis of Qatar, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran balanced against the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the other Sunni nations. And that's how you have peace, by sort of equilibrium. When Trump comes along with the Abraham Accords, you have a completely, and my learning and understanding of this came from Barak Ravid, the Israeli journalist,
yes,
who happens to hate Trump and not so fond of Bibi. His documentation of the Abraham Accords, it's rather astonishing if you want to get into the detail on this. I can't work out how the Biden administration, having seen what was achieved in the 4 years of Trump, wouldn't continue with that policy, but instead reverted back to the consistently failed approach of the previous, of Obama's administration. Now, one other possible motivation for that, as I've understood it, and you must correct me if you think I get anything wrong, is that the Democrats are sort of trying to appease the left, the far left of their voter base.
Yeah.
And that's why you get mixed messages. I don't know if you watched the VP debate with Tim Walz, where he there is not able, he's giving exactly the same sort of answer you've described, this kind of, yes, we support Israel, but there's got to be this, but then they never go into anything substantive in that. So that's why you have this that's how I understand the motivation behind that Biden worldview. It's kind of trying to appease the voter base, but at the same time, well, actually, I should fill that in. They hate Trump, so they can't give him a win. Now, do you think I've got that wrong?
I don't think any of that is incorrect. And what you say about the former President Trump, I mean, anyone else that would have brought together the Abraham Accords countries, even if it was his team that did the legwork, he was the president that signed it. Of course, he would have got a Nobel Peace Prize if he'd been anyone other than Trump. I think all of that is a significant factor, and it's linked. Everything we're talking about is linked, because the misinformation in the international media, what we've been seeing in the academies, especially in the US, has all fed into the intensity of feeling in that voter base, which this administration has been seeking to pander to. Mm-hmm. But I think there's also a refusal to wake up to the reality. That mantra from 2016 of John Kerry hasn't gone away. And Jake Sullivan, when he took over as National Security Advisor for Biden, he'd been the previous National Security Advisor to Hillary Clinton. I mean, that groupthink of the Democratic administrations at every juncture hasn't changed at all. And it is remarkable, truly remarkable, that the success of the Abraham Accords and that complete sea change in American policy didn't make them think more deeply about what it is that they had been previously doing and about what the mistakes were. And the reversion to the appeasement of Iran, in particular with the negotiations about the Iran deal Take Two, that were being led by Robert Malley, who was then subsequently suspended for being an Iranian plant. I mean, there's another aspect of this which many people have been discussing, which is the...
I didn't know that story, Robert Malley. Who is that?
Well, he was the chief negotiator for the Iran deal from the American administration. And there were a number of other individuals who were under subsequent investigation for similar reasons. So a number of people have been referencing the extent to which the Iranian regime may even have infiltrated the heart of American government. I don't know how much store to set by that, but it really is inexplicable that people that are committed to international security and American security in particular would be playing into the hands of the terrorists in this fashion. And more recently, in terms of the barrage of rockets that Israel and ballistic missiles that Israel has suffered from Iran, so many people have been calling out the American administration for releasing funds back to the Islamic regime in Iran, which it has been using to support not just its terror proxies, but also its own weapons arsenal.
It's even more remarkable because we are on the brink, it seems, of a situation which would be phenomenal for Western interests, which is that Hezbollah is about to be destroyed, Hamas is about to be destroyed. Israel have cleared out a lot of American enemies in the region.
Yes.
This should be perfect, time for the America to establish its
credentials as a supporter of Western interests in the region. I agree.
They must have lost faith in what it is to be Western. Do they even understand how important Israel's survival is to Western interests?
In the US?
Yeah.
I think there's a big question mark about that. And everything that we have seen in terms of the universities there also rather suggests that the conception that America is the cause of sort of evil in the world, or that Western democratic values and the freedom that is embodied is something to be ashamed of, has certainly taken root at universities. It's been at the centre of all of these encampments that we've seen. It undeniably has impacted a degree of the electorate also. But I think if we're seeing that filter up now into government policy, that's extremely troubling for places like this, the United Kingdom. I mean, ultimately, we do rely on stronger allies that share our belief systems in freedom and democracy to get on side and to get on the programme. And we'll have to wait and see what happens in November.
We'll wait and see. And the implication is that for geopolitics, at least, Trump is preferable if there's a continuation of the Abraham Accords.
If we're able to, I mean, nobody knows what a second Trump administration would necessarily look like.
It doesn't even look like Jared Kushner would come back. So it might not be a revival of the Abraham Accords.
It's not a particularly optimistic conversation, I'm afraid.
Do you think, flattering as we've alluded to the Abraham Accords, and we've made a sort of flattery allusions to the Abraham Accords, do you think have any criticisms of Trump's tenure and with regards to Israel?
I think more could certainly have been achieved. There was a great degree of headline-grabbing moves, like the recognition of Jerusalem, which is way out of time. I mean, America ought to have moved its embassy some time before it ultimately did under Trump, but the consistent waivers were being signed that cited security considerations that meant that even though domestic American law required the repositioning of the embassy in Israel's capital, that move was delayed. What I would have liked to see, really, in addition to the network building and alliance building between Israel and key strategic allies in the region, would have been a recognition of the real causes of this and a clamping down on indoctrination and incentivization to terror. And we didn't see that.
Because he's quite a deal maker. He for him, it's like, whatever happened, let's make a deal, right? That's his approach. So maybe that's kind of part and parcel of getting anything like the Abraham Accords, is that he's not going to really bother about how it started.
Well, I'm sure that's a significant contributing factor, but ultimately, the real hard work here isn't sexy. It requires very difficult steps. It requires the sort of de-radicalization that was engaged in with the denazification process after the with the Marshall Plan after the Nazis were defeated, or what the UAE engaged in with respect to the de-radicalization there. And it is going to take time. I mean, I'm now frequently referring, although I hadn't previously, to the story in Exodus where Moses walks the Israelites out of Egypt across the desert for 40 years. Mm. And many people have asked, why does it take 40 years to cross the desert? Geographically, if you look at the map, Israel's right next door, right? You can do the journey. If you're walking slowly, maybe a couple of months. 40 years is significant because when the Israelites left Egypt, they were a generation of slaves. And then before they got to the land of milk and honey, that generation needed to change. And a new generation needed to grow up in a tradition of freedom. And the longer that kindergartens are indoctrinating and victimizing Palestinian children by indoctrinating them to believe that their only future is martyrdom, every day that continues, peace is being pushed 40 years and a day away. Mm. And until we're able to grapple with that, and I would have liked to see, an American administration understand that impasse and have the impetus to do something about it.
The only problem with that analogy, if I may, we're going to be biblical, is that is when they do eventually make it to the promised land. Yes. We have, of course, the book of Joshua and the book of Judges. So we have hundreds of years of warfare between the...
Before we get to the modern state of Israel.
Yeah. Well, thousands of years before that.
And indeed, no democracy is perfect, and everything that Israel was experiencing, the political turmoil before the 7th of October is almost biblical in terms of the standards, but the need for a change of generation and or at least a change of, and I mean, it sits in stark contrast to the example I gave earlier of Begin and Sadat and peace that was able to completely transform in many respects, at least for the purposes of signing an agreement. I mean, there's a lot to be said for animosity that still exists from Egypt and ordinary Egyptians and the way that they are educated in schools towards Israel. So that would lend itself more to this biblical analogy that you really do need a change of generation. One that has been educated, as schools in Israel have educated generations of Israelis to be the highest calling is peace. And that is what they are seeking. And that it's possible.
Watch this segue into quick change. So things can take a long time to change, but they can also change quite quickly. Netanyahu, before October 7th, there were thousands of people protesting him.
Yeah.
When I went to visit Israel in January this year, 2024, his approval rating was something like 15%. Now, coming up to the year anniversary, with these huge gains he's met, he has gone up massively in popularity. What is your take on Netanyahu? What do you think his legacy is going to be after this, I think, the longest war that Israel have had since its founding? How is it changed, and how should we understand Bibi?
Well, I think the change in popularity, especially in light of the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah, which followed the elimination of Ismail Haniyeh, Mohammed Daif, the decimation of the majority of Hamas in Gaza. I mean, ultimately, everyone likes a winner, right? So especially after Nasrallah, especially after the context in which that happened. I mean, you explained it was the UN speech that was the opportunity that was used to take out Nasrallah. I mean, it's perhaps the first time that the UN has actually been useful for something, if it provided the kind of cover that enabled Israel to conduct this strike. But that clearly has had a significant impact on Netanyahu's popularity at home in Israel. I'd also just set a little bit of, I take with a pinch of salt, some of what the media says about Israeli internal politics, because for better or for worse, the reason that Netanyahu has again became Israel's prime minister of the last election is because he had sufficient support to establish a coalition. So, albeit that there are vocal protests, the electorate as a whole has consistently voted in Netanyahu and his coalition supporters. So that is something that needs to be taken into account. I think the sort of question in terms of where we go from here, I don't know if that would be sufficient for the elections, which will inevitably have to wait till after this current crisis to provide some alternative result. I mean, the opposition in Israel is not strong. One of the reasons that people have said that the left in Israel has been decimated is because their analysis, their worldview, has been proven to be so wrong when it comes to Israeli security.
That's interesting, yeah.
Oslo brought a second intifada. The withdrawal from Gaza created an Iranian outpost on the border of Israeli communities in the south. Concessions to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank have enabled Hamas to start gaining a stronghold. I mean, when you hear about Israeli raids into the West Bank at the moment, it's to deal with terror outposts and weapons caches, Iranian weapons caches that are already being built up. So, I mean, all of that, inevitably, security, because of Israel's position in the Middle East, because of the existential threats that it's under, security has always been at the forefront. But I think also something worth noting about Netanyahu is that in Israel, he's not actually seen as this warmonger that he seems to have a reputation of being outside of Israel. In fact, quite the opposite. He's in many respects seen as an appeaser. And that brings us back to our earlier discussion about him seeking to enter into some sort of longer-term understanding with the Hamas terrorists that have controlled Gaza to create a status quo in which that threat can be contained and Israel doesn't have to go in militarily to deal with it. And in fact, until October, Netanyahu had the track record of, I think, being the only recent Israeli prime minister not to enter into an armed conflict with enemies that are surrounding it. So the domestic opinion of Netanyahu is, in fact, actually very different to the one that is projected internationally. That's just something to bear in mind when one, seeks to read Israeli politics. And of course, it being a coalition system, it's an awful lot more complicated than, the first past the post here, proportional representation. The coalition building requires a balancing of many different interests and political standpoints that are sometimes pulling in different directions. And one of the things that after this crisis, an Israeli government is going to have to grapple with is this issue of judicial reform, which has been put on hold. And that was proving incredibly divisive, but a lot of that was as a result of misrepresentations about what was being presented. It's worth remembering that just before the last election, there was actually broad consensus across the political spectrum about the judicial reform that was necessary. And the opposition leaders, Lapid and Gantz, were calling for the same reforms that this last government has been seeking to drive forward. So the protests weren't necessarily so much to do with the actual reforms that were proposed. They were being misrepresented as, an attack on democracy, when in fact they were there to seek to institute democratic accountability and to provide a counterbalance to the court as a result of the judicial revolution, so-called, of Aaron Barak in the 1990s. The Israeli Supreme Court, unlike the UK Supreme Court, which purely deals with legal considerations, had essentially inserted itself into the political arena. And as I say, there was a general consensus that needed to be addressed. So that will be coming. But all of these internal political considerations, the judiciary, the division between religious and secular, all of that is essentially on hold now until Israel deals with the existential threats. And everything we have seen over the last couple of weeks in particular indicates that there may now be an opportunity to deal with the threat that Iran has consistently posed towards Israel. It's the vanguard of Iran against Israel was always Hezbollah. That was essentially the jewel in its crown. And it served two purposes. One was to attack Israel and be that kind of forward line. And we have seen that over the last 12 months. But the other was to provide a degree of deterrence. And that's what the stockpiles of hundreds of thousands of longer-range missiles were designed to achieve, a deterrence that would prevent Israel from taking out the threat that Iran presented in terms of the nuclear installations. That may now be gone with Hezbollah in disarray. That is a game changer.
Yeah.
And I think the focus of Israeli society and Israeli politics more generally is what is going to be done as a result of that game-changing scenario? And can the threat of Iran to Israel and the rest of the region be dealt with now once and for all?
Do you have any ideas about what we can expect next?
Well, I think the region is very much braced for Israel's response to that barrage of ballistic missiles. The Americans have also endorsed that this is going to have to be a significant one. There's certainly some talk about Israel targeting the Iranian nuclear facilities. The other, I think you mentioned right at the start, the other part of the discussion has been a focus on Iran's oil installations, because that is how the IGRC is making ends meet at the moment. And it actually is significant in that it's something that the regime relies upon, but the civilian community in Iran doesn't require. So that might be a possible target. Otherwise, what we saw in relation...
Why doesn't the civilian...
because this is to do with Iran's ability to export oil to generate funds. So these are regime installations. Likewise, anti-aircraft installations were a target after the April 15th barrage of ballistic missiles, drones, rockets that Iran fired on Israel. That was the response, and that was a very limited response, but it was a response that indicated that Israel is able to operate there, in Iran, in Syria, in Yemen, that it has the capability to do so. And that should have sent a very strong message to the Ayatollahs. Obviously, we've talked about the mixed messaging that has emanated from America. Clearly, it wasn't a strong enough message because of what we saw in the last couple of days. But the difference in America's approach, having told Israel to take the win in April, by which it meant rely on the fact that Israel's domestic weapons defense systems had proven miraculous. I mean, there was an international coalition. The Royal Air Force was included in that, in taking out some of the projectiles from Iran before they reached Israel. But the coordination between Israel's three major aerial defense systems, Iron Dome, which we hear about a lot in relation to shorter range rockets, David's Sling, which deals with deals with longer range rockets actually outside of the atmosphere, and also Chet's arrow, the various arrow systems. Their ability to work in conjunction with each other, both in April and just recently, is extraordinary. It's made history. Military history and technological history. And that has been an enormous game changer, because the discussion internally in Israel in terms of taking on the Iranian threat before was always in relation to the tens of thousands of Israeli civilian casualties that would be expected as a result of all of those longer range missiles being, raining down on Israeli civilian communities.
And this week we learned, there was only one casualty, which was a Gazan man in the West Bank, in Jericho. Was it seems like the only casualty so far from the latest ballistic missile strike from Iran.
Yes, I mean, one shouldn't be overly confident because, again, while I was on the way to see you here at the studio, there were red alerts across Israel. So I believe from Lebanon. So Hezbollah was continuing to fire. And their weapons caches are enormous. So their ability to communicate and to coordinate and to fire those may have been substantially impeded by things like the pager operation and the walkie-talkies and taking out Hassan Nasrallah. But there's every expectation that the threat, the latent threat is still very much there. And ultimately, this is going to take a long time and may yet be very costly. to deal with properly.
Yeah. I want to ask about your tour with our mutual friend, Douglas Murray. I saw you on stage with him in New York City, Manhattan at the Beacon Theatre. I thought you were phenomenal. I mean, Douglas, of course.
Douglas is a wonderful, just inspirational thought leader, not just on these issues, but to see the incredible support, not just at the Beacon, but across the
So you did about a week with him?
3 weeks.
3 weeks. Oh, excuse me.
Yeah.
Right. Well, before we get to Douglas, I just want to flatter you, if I may.
I'm English. I can't.
You had fantastic questions for Douglas.
Yeah.
Compelling all the way through, completely engaging, and you asked all the important questions, so you were fantastic, and it really was a special evening at the Beacon Theatre, completely full, not just Douglas fans, but also your fans. And it's not surprising to see the fans you've amassed, given your being so vocal since October 7th. It was wonderful to see that celebration for Douglas, to see him getting the recognition he deserved. So I wondered what your experience was on that tour, what you learned from Douglas, what your big takeaways were.
Well, it was an experience, certainly something I've never done before. We began in Fort Lauderdale, Miami. We were in DC, and then we were in LA and in New York. And actually, I used the opportunity to give quite a few other talks while I was there. So I also spoke at the United Nations at a panel on proportionality and conflict. An extraordinary opportunity in and of itself.
Wow.
It looked like the best room that the UN had to offer within the headquarters at the UN building. We had this incredible view of the river, and I was privileged to share a platform with Professor Alan Dershowitz, John Spencer, Andrew Fox,
Wow.
Major Andrew Fox, Colonel Richard Kemp.
Wow. Fantastic.
I think it was one of the first times, certainly I remember, a real discussion about real international law, what proportionality means, and what Israel was doing on the ground, given the fact that Andrew, Richard and myself had all been on the ground in Gaza very recently.
Proportionality has come up as a word from people attacking Israel. Is that why this word, I keep hearing this, we've heard this since the beginning of the conflict?
We have, and it's being misused. I mean, proportionality is probably the most misrepresented aspect of international law in history. Many people refer to it as though you have to compare casualty figures on both sides, and a proportional response is one that's equal or equivalent. I mean, that's nonsense. It's not how international law works. It's also macabre to think about matters in those terms, and it would only serve, if that was the reality, would only serve to encourage Hamas to increase the civilian casualty count. Proportionality is a principle in the laws of armed conflict, and it requires a military commander to weigh up the anticipated collateral damage against the expected military advantage of a strike. So in international law, in the law of armed conflict in particular, there is a general expectation. It's very sad, but there is a general expectation that there will be civilian casualties. And the laws of armed conflict are designed to try and keep those as low as possible. And proportionality looks at the need to advance military goals. Here in the case of Gaza, it was defeating Hamas as a political and military entity and returning the hostages. In the north of Israel, vis-a-vis Hezbollah, it's creating a situation where the 60,000 plus Israelis who have been evacuated from their homes in the north of the last 12 months are able to return home because Hezbollah is no longer firing incessantly on those communities. And when you look at the broader aims, and then you also look at individual military aims. So what is the anticipated military advantage of hitting a Hamas command center? They will no longer be able to use it to operate. Or taking out a weapons, a rocket launch facility. They won't be able to fire onto Israeli civilian communities with it. So each of those individual military advantages, which are direct and concrete, need to be weighed up against the anticipated or the expected civilian collateral damage to make sure that isn't excessive. There is no universal formula that deals with this, but I have seen the target analyses conducted by the Military Advocate General Corps, the lawyers in Israel, that go through the intelligence that has been received on each individual target and the expected civilian collateral damage, and decide on that case-by-case basis, on a strike-by-strike basis, whether that strike is proportional. That is what proportionality means. The United States and even the UK, in their analysis on proportionality and targeting under international humanitarian law, have said that they don't see Israel to be in breach of international humanitarian law. I've heard other experts go further to say no other Western moral military takes the measures that Israel does to address proportionality analysis in terms of its targeting lists, and then also in terms of the strikes that it undertakes. And that sits hand in hand with the principle of precaution, which is to keep civilian casualties as low as possible. And all of the measures that Israel takes in that respect are the warnings that it issues to individual householders via text message, via phone call, leaflets that are dropped, loudspeakers indicating evacuation routes, and then Israeli defense forces actually manning these evacuation routes and protecting Palestinian civilians leaving from oncoming Palestinian terrorist fire. So Hamas have been firing on civilians as they've been trying to leave, and Israel has been providing that kind of protection to evacuate civilians. So all of that ultimately informs proportionality, the real proportionality, the rule that exists in international humanitarian law. But the way that it's used, not just by the media, but also by international statesmen. I mean, Biden said today Israel's response to Iran needs to be proportionate. What did he mean by that? I mean, the analysis that Israel has carried out with respect to all of the previous strikes clearly involve proportionality analysis, because that is part of the procedures that the IDF operates according to. But I think Biden was probably using that term in the political sense, not the legal sense, that it is often now playing out. You know, a proportionate response is one that takes in. I don't know. Honestly, I don't think that it has been defined in terms of outside of the legal context.
So this discussion, you're in the belly of the beast. You're at the UN, who've been criticising in this conversation, with a panel that it seems would have generally your worldview and an agreeable panel. Am I right in thinking?
I think a lot of, with the exception of, I think, Professor Dershowitz, everyone else had been on the ground in Gaza and had seen the processes that the IDF were applying. So in that respect, we were operating off the same information, and we did agree in terms of Israel's approach and processes.
So, but you're there.
Yes.
Do you think that your message was heard by the UN and people there?
I don't know how many delegates were in the audience. It was an open event, so anyone who registered was able to attend. Clearly, in terms of the rhetoric that we have been hearing from many states, you know, talking incorrectly about proportionality, it would have been a much better thing had they all attended this event and received an education in what proportionality is. But there's a much bigger battle here to be fought, which is to contend with these, you know, political terms which are an abuse of the actual legal terminology. So the reality is, I don't know. But then I've spoken at the UN a number of times at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva and called out the hypocrisy of the UN Human Rights Council and its criticism of Israel. And even if it doesn't end up convincing delegates, I think it's so important that the truth is aired, that criticism is voiced, and that ultimately these institutions, the United Nations, are held to account. And there are NGOs, I mean, UK Lawyers for Israel has been doing a great deal with respect to that. UN Watch is also a watchdog based in Geneva that calls out the malpractice of UN employees, in particular those of UNRWA who participated in the atrocities. It has also called out special rapporteurs. It has called out the UN Secretary General. I mean, his rhetoric has been utterly disgraceful. Utterly disgraceful. And the head of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, seeking to make excuses or essentially standing on immunity for UNRWA employees so that they are not able to be not prosecuted, but at least addressed within the US legal framework on behalf of the victims of families of victims of the 7th of October is truly disgraceful. But it's all part of, unfortunately, the kind of complicity that the UN has in so much of this terrorism against the Jewish state.
Mm. So that was the UN.
Yeah.
Back to Douglas.
Yes.
What can you tell us about Douglas and that experience? The Beacon, how was that for you?
Look, the reaction, the atmosphere, the feedback has been utterly phenomenal, really overwhelming. And I think, certainly from my perspective, I started this to address the misrepresentations of international law, and nobody else was, at least on broadcast media, addressing the law correctly, as I could see it. So I felt a real imperative. I felt a duty. I didn't feel I had a choice. I mean, since then, I've had the opportunity to speak about many other broader issues that I feel keenly. This is a subject I've been steeped in for over 20 years. And there is an awful lot in terms of the broader misrepresentations that need to be grappled with. I've known Douglas for a big chunk of that period, over 15 years. And I've seen the incredible work that he has done on pushing back against the misrepresentations, on informing the public debate, and on dealing with extremism and terrorism. And more recently also correcting a lot of the misinformation about Israel. So it was a real honour and a real privilege to be able to, join forces with him for this. And I would say...
He felt that way about you, I'm sure.
Well, he kept saying so, which was very nice of him. But I think especially where the voices of truth are few and far between, it's so important to coordinate and cooperate as much as possible. From my perspective, I found that the support and enthusiasm, I don't want to say surprising, because I've also been inundated with messages from around the world for the last 12 months, which have been wonderful, and I'm concerned that I've just not been able to respond to everyone. To reiterate, appreciation for telling things as they are, for holding people to account. Again, I've never seen that as a choice. So, when people say thank you, I do find it a little...
Because it's a duty.
Because, in every respect, that is how I was brought up. That's what my profession stands for. It's, in every respect, I consider it a duty. And I see Douglas very similarly approaching, his duties as a journalist, standing up for the truth, proper reporting. And he's not just done that in Israel, he's also been on the ground in Ukraine, and has been leading this fight. So I worked with Douglas at the Centre for Social Cohesion in 2009. So he's been doing this a very long time. And I know that he's certainly come to prominence more recently, very much more prominence more recently. But those of us who have followed his work for well over a decade know that there's been a consistency of approach there, which is laudable. Mm-hmm. And I hope that what we undertook the last 3 weeks across the United States will encourage more people to stand up, to educate themselves, to push back against the misrepresentations. I mean, that's been my main motivating factor, to give people the information and the confidence to address these matters for themselves. Yeah. And especially where international law is concerned, the general levels of literacy on international law are low, and people don't feel equipped to push back against the falsehoods. Yeah. And that needs to be addressed.
I was thinking of a wonderful Tom Stoppard line whilst I was hearing you and Douglas speak, which it's not exactly this, but it's something like, if you get writing is amazing, or words are amazing, because if you get the right words in the right order, you can nudge the world just that little bit. And I felt, hearing you both speaking, it's not only is it cathartic just to hear the truth when it's said sometimes, but just to even articulate it in a way that's so simple, which both of you have such talent to do. It was really, really very moving and special. And I do hope that you do more shows, and I hope that you speak with Douglas here in the UK and across the world, because I think more people need to go and see it. We've covered so much in this conversation. I actually have more questions, but maybe we should plan to do this again. Is there anything that you think that we ought to have covered, or any gaps in the wider conversation that are important for what we did cover?
Well, one thing which we certainly haven't covered in detail, and I'm more than happy to come back on another occasion to address your other questions, but the situation certainly at universities here in the UK.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about that.
Okay. Is extremely worrying. Not just because, through UK Lawyers for Israel, we've often been assisting individual students on campus and facing individual harassment and unbelievable material in the courses that are being taught that is, blatant propaganda, anti-Israel propaganda. But also the encampments, the intimidation that we have seen, the pressure on universities to supposedly divest from Israel, to cease their relationships with Israeli academic institutions. The trajectory on this is extremely troubling. I'm going to be at the Oxford Union for a debate on the 28th of November. A lot of people have sought to warn me off that.
What's the topic? What's the motion?
I think it's still in the works, so that will be to be
on
decided.
Israel.
It is on Israel, and I think some of the allegations that they wanted to cover were, apartheid and genocide. I see those both as linked because they are essentially the modern blood libels that are being advanced, just like the ancient blood libel was being advanced, that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood for religious ritual. The modern blood libels are, in fact, all couched in international legal terms: occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, genocide. So my understanding is that that's the focus of it. But, a lot of people have sought to warn me off because of the hostility that campuses have embraced. I'm a big believer in freedom of speech. I was at Oxford. I played a significant role at the Union in my time there.
That explains your talent for speaking publicly. But
and I think it's so important that nobody gives in to that sort of intimidation. I certainly won't be. So we need to ask ourselves big questions about how this has happened before we can hope to fathom, how to fix it. And this came up repeatedly in terms of the shows in the US because it's an enormous problem across the United States also. And I do think that to a certain extent, it is on us. If this has been born out of a lack of purpose. And I feel extremely blessed to have had purpose in my life, both in terms of my professional life now, in terms of everything that I'm doing on this particular level. And if young people have, through a lack of purpose, been hoodwinked into supporting internationally prescribed terrorist organizations and to camping out and feeling that they are part of something bigger as a result, that's on us. That is a failure to educate, to properly appreciate the freedoms that they have grown up with, that they are privileged to enjoy in liberal democratic countries. And that's a much bigger question that we probably need to unpack on a separate occasion, but it's something to be mindful of because there's been a hiatus, over the summer holidays, but universities are going back now. And I don't think that these issues have necessarily been put to bed.
Yeah. And we mentioned earlier Dr. Andreas Craig, who was the, I believe, King's College professor who went on to the BBC spouting.
Extraordinary.
Essentially Qatari Al Jazeera lines. And the Qataris have deeply put their fingers into the British institutions, not least the universities, and that deeply worries me. I think that maybe I would take this conversation into a failure of the British elites, be they Conservative or Labour, have completely sold this country out to our adversaries who are intelligently polluting the minds of our young people. It's a very profound problem for which I'm not entirely sure I know what the solution is, but I think it's on the political level as well as the institutional level, we need massive change.
And as with many of these things, follow the money. Follow the money, see where the funding has come from and see what has come as part of the deal of that. And I understand that there are several studies underway. I do hope that we'll see more exposés about how the situation has arisen, how things have gotten so bad.
Well, on that note, Natasha, thank you so much for speaking with me. Absolutely fascinating conversation, and you are truly brilliant.
Thank you.
I'm sure listeners will have absolutely loved that. Thank you. And is there anywhere you'd like to point listeners where they can find your work, follow you online? Is there a website or social media or?
Still working on the latter. Reluctantly, very reluctantly, but the UK Lawyers for Israel website does actually include a lot of information. We've put out a lot of briefings that summarise some of the topics that we've discussed today, of those who want to educate themselves. And there's a wealth of material also on the UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust YouTube channel. But I should also say thank you for what you've been doing, because this podcast and your other initiatives and the thought leadership that you have provided, it's a space for rigorous discussion that isn't as plentiful as it should be. And so that you're serving a very important role in that respect, Winston, and long may that continue.
Very kind. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I get to talk to brilliant, fascinating, intelligent people like you. So thank you so much, and we'll do it again.
Looking forward to that.
Thanks for watching The Winston Marshall Show with me, Winston Marshall. If you enjoyed hearing from Natasha Hausdorff and you want to hear more great guests, remember, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you can do that, I'm going to have more great guests exploring the issues you want to hear about. But for now, be well.